He didn't knock. He never knocked. Derek Hayes kicked the apartment door open so hard the frame cracked, and Lucia Valls pressed herself against the kitchen wall, a dish towel clutched in both fists, like it could somehow protect her. She knew the sound of his footsteps on the stairs. She knew the difference between the way he walked when he was merely angry and the way he walked when he had already decided what was going to happen. Tonight was the second kind. "You think I didn't see you talking to him?" Derek's voice was low, which was worse than when he screamed. "The guy at the bodega, you smiled at him, Lucia. You smiled." She opened her mouth, closed it. There was nothing to say. She had learned that 18 months ago. Words fed it. Silence fed it too. Everything fed it. From the back bedroom, she could hear her grandmother shifting in her bed, the soft creak of the mattress, and the sound broke something open in Lucia's chest. Sophia was 73 years old. She had a bad hip and worse lungs, and she did not deserve to lie in the dark listening to this. Derek stepped closer. Lucia's shoulder blades met the wall. Then the knock came. Not a knock. A strike. 4 deliberate, unhurried blows against the front door that somehow cut straight through Derek's rage and silenced the room completely. Derek froze. Lucia froze. The knock came again, and this time a voice followed it, calm, deep, carrying the particular weight of a man who has never once needed to raise it. "Open the door, Mr. Hayes. I won't ask twice. If you have ever stood between danger and someone who needed you to be brave, drop a comment below with your city or your country. Let me see how far this story travels. And if you believe a woman like Lucia deserved better long before that knock arrived, hit like, subscribe, and don't go anywhere, because what happens next will change everything." Part 1. The man on the other side of the door was not a police officer. Lucia knew that the moment Derek opened it, or rather, the moment Derek's entire body language changed, the aggression drained out of him the way color drains from a face. Whatever Derek Hayes was, whatever cruelty he had built his small life around, he recognized something in Matteo Moretti's expression that Lucia had never managed to put there herself. Fear. Clean, unambiguous fear. Matteo was not a large man in the way movies described large men. He was not broad or loud or visibly armed. He wore a dark jacket over a plain shirt, and his hands were in his pockets, and he stood in the hallway outside their apartment the way a building stands, like he had been there before the hallway was built and would remain after it was gone. His hair was dark, going silver at the temples. He was somewhere past 50, maybe well past, and his face had the particular stillness of someone who had made a great many decisions he would not apologize for. He looked at Derek once. "I own this building," he said. "I received a complaint." Derek found his voice somewhere in his boots. "From who? Nobody called." "I didn't say a call." Matteo's eyes moved past Derek to Lucia. He looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient, assessing, not pitying. He clocked the dish towel in her hands, the way she was pressed against the wall, the crack in the door frame he would have had to walk past to reach the apartment. "Miss Valls." She had no idea how he knew her name. "You and your grandmother will pack whatever you need tonight. I have a car waiting downstairs." He said it the way someone says the meeting is at 9, as if the logistics were already settled, as if the only remaining variable was how quickly she would accept it. Derek stepped forward. He was not a small man either, and whatever fear had seized him a moment ago, his pride was louder. "Excuse me? You can't just walk up here and—" "Derek." Matteo said his name once, quietly, and something in the syllables stopped Derek Hayes mid-sentence. Matteo reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded envelope. He held it out to Derek without looking at him, eyes still on Lucia. "Your lease termination agreement. Tonight. You can sign it, or I can have it filed without your signature. Either way, you will not be sleeping in this apartment tomorrow." Derek stared at the envelope. His jaw worked. "I'd take it," Matteo said mildly. The silence in that hallway lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then Derek Hayes, who had made Lucia's life a living horror for a year and a half, took the envelope with a shaking hand and stepped back from the door, and said nothing else for the rest of the night. Lucia did not trust it. That was the honest truth of those first hours, and she would not pretend otherwise even later when pretending would have been easy. She packed a bag for herself and a bag for Sophia, moving on autopilot while Matteo waited in the hallway with the particular patience of someone who has waited for many things and learned not to telegraph urgency. She kept expecting the catch, the clause, the moment when the terms of this rescue would be made clear. Sophia came out of the bedroom in her robe and slippers, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, and looked at Matteo Moretti standing in her doorway with the calm assessment of a woman who had survived enough of the 20th century to know that unusual men came in all varieties. "You the landlord?" Sophia said. "Yes, ma'am." Sophia looked him over for a moment. "Lucia's father always said the landlord was never on your side." Something shifted in Matteo's expression. Not a smile exactly, but the shape one makes before a smile decides not to fully form. "Your father was probably right most of the time. You going to try to put us in some terrible place? I have a property on the north side, clean, secure. Your granddaughter can stay as long as she needs." He paused. "No lease required." Sophia looked at Lucia. Lucia looked at her hands. She still had the dish towel. "All right," Sophia said, and shuffled back to get her cardigan. The safe house was a 2-bedroom apartment on the 11th floor of a building that smelled like fresh paint and had a doorman who did not look like any doorman Lucia had ever seen. He had the eyes of someone who counted exits automatically, the way other people counted change. He nodded at Matteo and opened the door without being asked. Lucia put Sophia to bed in the larger room. She sat on the edge of the mattress while her grandmother's breathing evened out, and she listened to the sounds of the building, the elevator, distant traffic, the particular white noise hum of a city that was going about its business without any knowledge of the evening she'd just had. Then she went to the kitchen and sat at the table and tried to figure out what had just happened. Matteo was still there. He was standing by the window with a coffee cup, which he hadn't asked for permission to make, looking out at the city the way people look at things they own. "How did you know my name?" Lucia said. He turned from the window. "I do background on all my tenants." "That's not—" She stopped. Tried again. "That's not all of it. You knew something was wrong. You knew specifically." Matteo was quiet for a moment. He set the cup down on the counter. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Ferrante, 3rd floor. She called my management office 4 times in the last 2 months. Mrs. Ferrante doesn't speak English. My office speaks Italian." He looked at her steadily. She described what she heard through the ceiling. She was specific. Lucia felt the back of her neck go hot. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated than shame, the way it feels when someone has witnessed something you have spent all your energy pretending didn't happen. She looked at the table surface. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know. People don't just—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "What do you want from me? You have to want something." The question came out harder than she intended, but she did not take it back. She had learned, at significant cost, that softness in the face of inexplicable generosity was how you ended up owing something you hadn't agreed to owe. Matteo pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He didn't lean forward, didn't try to close the distance between them in any way that would feel like pressure. "Nothing," he said simply. "I want nothing from you." She stared at him. "You're going to tell me you don't believe that," he said. "I don't believe that." "That's reasonable?" He picked up his coffee cup again. "You can believe it or not believe it. The apartment is yours either way." She studied his face for the kind of tells she had learned to read, the slight tightening around the eyes, the way a mouth can smile while the rest of the face does something completely different. She found nothing. Either he was the most controlled person she had ever encountered, or he was telling the truth, and she couldn't yet determine which possibility frightened her more. "My grandmother has a pulmonologist appointment Thursday," Lucia said finally. "Not thank you. She was not ready for that. I'll have someone drive her." "I'll drive her myself." A beat. "I'll have someone follow you." She almost argued. She looked at his face and decided, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, that this particular argument could wait. Sleep, that first night, came the way sleep had not come in 18 months. Completely and without interruption. No footsteps on stairs, no key in the lock, no lying rigid in the dark, trying to determine from the sound of breathing alone whether this was a night that required vigilance or merely dread. She lay down on the narrow bed in the 2nd bedroom, and the last thought she had before losing consciousness was the strangeness of silence. She woke up at 7 in the morning. Light was coming through curtains she hadn't chosen, in a room she hadn't lived in a week ago, in a building owned by a man she did not understand. From the kitchen, she could smell coffee already brewing, and she heard her grandmother's voice, animated, talking to someone. She got up. Sophia was at the kitchen table across from a young woman with a tablet and a canvas bag from a bakery. Sophia was talking about a neighborhood in Naples she had lived in before she was 20, and the young woman was nodding with the politely engaged expression of someone who has been well trained in the art of making people feel heard. When Lucia came in, the young woman stood up. "Miss Valls, I'm Karina. I work for Mr. Moretti's residential team. I brought some things for the apartment, groceries, toiletries, and a list of what's already here. You can mark whatever you need and I'll arrange delivery." Lucia looked at the list, then at the bakery bag, then at Karina. "He does this for all his tenants?" Lucia said. Karina's expression was carefully neutral. "Mr. Moretti takes care of the people in his buildings." It was not an answer. Lucia understood that. She poured herself coffee and stood at the counter and tried to work out what kind of man sent a trained assistant with bakery goods at 7 in the morning. The kind with resources, obviously. The kind with systems. People who did specific things in specific ways. She had grown up with very little and built what she had with her own hands, and she understood systems mostly through their absence in her own life. She also understood, at a low instinctive level that she did not yet have language for, that Matteo Moretti was not operating within any framework of generosity she had previously encountered. That should have frightened her more than it did. The following week passed in a strange, suspended quality, the way time passes when you are recovering from something your body hasn't finished processing yet. Lucia found work at a dry cleaning shop 12 minutes walk from the apartment. The owner, a compact Greek woman named Dina, asked no questions and paid cash. Sophia went to her pulmonologist appointment and came back declaring the new doctor was thorough, which in Sophia's vocabulary was the highest possible praise. Lucia did not see Matteo. She told herself she wasn't looking for him. She told herself she had simply exchanged one complicated situation for another, and the smartest thing she could do was keep her head down, build up enough savings to find her own place, and not accumulate any debt, emotional or otherwise, to the man who had pulled them out. Then, on Thursday evening of the second week, she came home to find Matteo in the hallway outside the apartment, talking to the doorman who wasn't. He had a folder under his arm and the expression of a man who had been working since before the sun came up and planned to keep working after it went down. He looked up when she came off the elevator. "Miss Valls." "Lucia," she said, and surprised herself with it. "You can call me Lucia. You know, given." Something in his eyes shifted. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Lucia." She stopped in front of her door. "Is there something I wanted to tell you in person?" He held out the folder. Derek Hayes signed the termination. He cleared his belongings from the apartment last Monday. As of this morning, he's been formally excluded from the property under a no-contact and no-access order that covers this building and all properties I own in the city. She took the folder, opened it, looked at Derek's signature at the bottom of the termination form. Messy, pressured, the handwriting of someone whose hand was shaking. "What exactly did you say to him?" she asked. "I explained his options." "That's not an answer." "No," Matteo agreed. "It isn't." She looked up from the folder. He was watching her with that same steady, assessing quality he'd had in the hallway 2 weeks ago, and she had a sudden, sharp awareness of the fact that she still didn't know the actual dimensions of who this man was. She knew his name. She knew the surface of him. Below that, she knew essentially nothing. "I'll need to understand at some point," she said carefully, "exactly who you are." "Yes," he said, with a gravity that she would not fully understand until much later. "You will." He said goodnight. He walked to the elevator. She stood in the hallway with the termination folder in her hands, listening to the doors close, and she had the distinct, unsettling sensation that the night Derek Hayes had kicked in her door, the night that had felt like her worst, had actually been the beginning of something, not the end of it. She didn't know yet what kind of beginning. She went inside. She made dinner. She listened to her grandmother sing something old and tuneless in the next room, and she sat with the quiet, and she tried, for the first time in a very long time, to simply let herself be where she was without waiting for everything to collapse. She almost managed it. Almost. The folder sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days. Lucia didn't file it, didn't throw it away. It occupied the corner of the counter the way unresolved things occupy space, present, insistent, radiating a low-level significance she hadn't yet figured out how to categorize. She would pass it going to the coffee maker in the morning and not touch it. She would pass it coming back from the sink and not touch it. Sophia noticed it on the second day and said nothing, which meant Sophia had already drawn her own conclusions. On the fourth day, Lucia picked it up and put it in the drawer under the dish towels. It didn't help. Dina, at the dry cleaning shop, was the kind of woman who asked nothing and noticed everything. She was 61, had been in this city since she was 19, and had outlasted 3 landlords, 2 recessions, and 1 husband she described as a beautiful mistake. She gave Lucia the afternoon shift, which suited them both, and she had a way of occupying silence that made it feel inhabited rather than empty. On Lucia's 9th day of work, a man came in with 4 suits. He was polite, well-dressed, and when he paid, he said, almost as an afterthought, "Mr. Moretti sends his regards. He says the alterations on the 3rd suit were particularly good." Lucia had altered no suits. She had been working the counter. She looked at Dina after he left. Dina was already busy with the press, her back turned, but her shoulders had the particular set of someone who had just decided not to have a conversation. "Dina. Has Mr. Moretti sent work here before?" A pause. The press hissed. "He refers people from time to time. He knows I run a clean operation." "How long have you known him?" Dina turned around. She had the direct, unhurried gaze of someone who had been asked questions she didn't want to answer often enough that she'd developed a whole economy of response around them. "Long enough to know he's not someone you figure out in 2 weeks," she said, "and long enough to know that the people he looks after don't tend to have accidents." Lucia absorbed that. "Is that meant to be reassuring?" "It's meant to be accurate." Dina turned back to the press. "There's a difference." That evening, Lucia took the long way home, cutting through the park on Vellum Street, because the air had gone cool and sharp the way it does in early October, and she wasn't ready to be inside yet. She sat on a bench near the fountain that had been turned off for the season and watched a man walk a dog that was clearly walking him, and she tried to take an honest inventory of her situation. She was safe. That was real and should not be minimized. For the first time in 18 months, she was sleeping through the night in a place where no one had a key who could hurt her. Sophia was better, color in her face, appetite returned, filling the apartment with the particular low-level domestic noise that Lucia had not realized she'd been missing until it came back. These were not small things, but she was also, undeniably, inside something she hadn't chosen and couldn't fully see. Matteo Moretti had resources that went beyond a successful property business. He had people, Carina with her tablet and her training, the doorman with his counting eyes, the man in the shop with his regards and his 4 suits. He had a reach into the ordinary texture of daily life that felt less like a landlord's influence and more like something structural, something woven in. The dog finished walking its owner and disappeared around the bend. The fountain sat empty and cold. Lucia was not naive. She had grown up without much, which meant she had grown up watching how power actually moved through a neighborhood, not through the people who announced it, but through the ones who simply made things happen without explanation. She had recognized the type when she was 11 years old, watching a man on her block settle a dispute between 2 families without anyone calling the police or going to court. The dispute simply stopped. The man went back inside. She was not naive, but she was tired, and she was safe, and she had a grandmother who was sleeping without a cough for the first time in months, and she was not ready, not yet, to pull at the thread. She went home. Matteo came by on a Friday, late afternoon, the kind of visit that was clearly not just a visit. He knocked, which struck her as deliberate somehow. And when she opened the door, he had a bag of food from the Italian place on Terrano that she had mentioned once, to Carina, in passing, and had not expected to be remembered. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. "I was in the area," he said. "You own the area," she said, the not-quite smile again. "May I come in?" Sophia appeared from the hallway like she'd been waiting, which she probably had been. "Of course he can come in. Lucia, move." They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Sophia talked about Naples again, and Matteo listened with the focused attention of someone for whom listening was a practiced and deliberate act. He asked specific questions, street names, the market near the port, what the summers were like. Sophia glowed the way she did when she felt genuinely heard, and Lucia watched both of them across the table and felt something shift inside her chest. Not trust. She was not calling it trust, something that lived in the same neighborhood as trust, and might eventually apply for residency there. Later, after Sophia had gone to bed, and Matteo was putting on his jacket to leave, Lucia stood at the kitchen counter and said, without quite planning to, "She hasn't talked about Naples like that in years." Matteo paused at the door. He looked at her with the same steady quality she was beginning to recognize. That sense of complete, unhurried attention, the world narrowed to exactly what was in front of him. "She deserves to," he said. Then he said goodnight and left. And Lucia stood in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of his footsteps faded, her hands wrapped around a cooling coffee cup, understanding with a clarity that unsettled her that the thread she had decided not to pull was already, quietly, unraveling on its own. 3 weeks after Matteo Moretti sat at her kitchen table and asked her grandmother about Naples, Lucia found a photograph slipped under the apartment door. It was not an envelope. No note. Just a single printed photograph, the kind pulled from a surveillance feed, slightly grainy at the edges, the way those images always are when someone has cropped and enlarged them past their natural resolution. The image showed Lucia coming out of Dina's dry cleaning shop. Timestamp in the lower right corner, 6:41 in the evening, 4 days ago. She remembered that evening. She had stayed late to finish a hem alteration on a wedding dress. She was alone in the photograph. That was the point of the photograph, to show her that someone had been watching and that they had been close enough to see her face clearly and that they wanted her to know both of those things. She stood in the hallway in her socks holding the photograph for a long time. Then she went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, drank half of it, and called the number Matteo had left with Karina 3 weeks ago for emergencies. He picked up on the second ring. "Someone put a photograph under my door," she said. No preamble. She had learned, somewhere in the accumulated weight of the last year, that preambles were a luxury for people who weren't frightened. A pause on his end. Not the pause of someone surprised, she noticed. The pause of someone who had been waiting for a specific kind of news and had just received it. "Don't touch it again. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 14:08. He came with 2 men she hadn't seen before. Not the counting-eyes doorman, different ones, quieter, who positioned themselves in the hallway outside the apartment without being asked and stayed there without moving. Matteo took the photograph by the corner, looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, and set it on the counter. "You know who sent it," Lucia said. It wasn't a question. "I have a reasonable idea." "Tell me." He looked at her. She held the look. She had stopped flinching from his steadiness somewhere in the past 3 weeks without fully registering when it happened. "His name is Vesci," Matteo said. "He runs an operation on the south and east side of the city. We've had disagreements for some time." "Disagreements," she repeated. "That's the accurate word?" "And he sent this because he's been watching me." Matteo picked up the photograph again, looked at the timestamp. "And he found you." The water glass was still on the counter. Lucia looked at it. She thought about the 6:41 timestamp, the specific evening, the hem alteration on the wedding dress. She thought about all the other evenings before that one, all the times she had walked to and from Dina's shop without looking over her shoulder because she had genuinely believed, that the worst of it was behind her. "You should have told me this was possible," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. "Yes," Matteo said. "I should have." She had not expected him to simply agree. The agreement landed harder than an argument would have. "That's it? Just yes?" "I made a calculation. I thought—" He stopped. Something moved across his face, a rare breach in the composure, there and gone. "I thought I had more time before he noticed. I was wrong." "More time to what? To warn me? To move us somewhere else? To resolve it before it reached you?" He said it quietly, but the weight in it was considerable. "I wanted it resolved before it reached you." Lucia put both hands flat on the counter. "Matteo, I need you to understand something. I spent 18 months in an apartment with a man who made decisions about my safety without telling me the reasoning. I am not doing that again, not with anyone, not even someone who means well." The room was very quiet. One of the men in the hallway shifted his weight. The building hummed its white noise hum. Matteo held her gaze. "You're right," he said. "Sit down. I'll tell you everything." It took almost 2 hours. Sophia came out of her bedroom at one point, assessed the situation with the precision of a woman who had survived the better part of a century, made tea for everyone without being asked, and went back to bed. The two men in the hallway accepted their cups through the cracked door without comment. What Matteo told her was not simple and did not become simpler in the telling. He had built what he called an organization. He used that word consistently, never anything more specific. Over roughly 25 years, starting with property and expanding into areas he described in broad strokes that Lucia understood were deliberately broad. Control of supply chains, arrangements with certain city officials, enforcement of agreements between parties who preferred not to involve the legal system. He said all of it without apology and without theater, the way someone describes the weather in a city they've lived in their whole life. Here is the climate. Here is what you prepare for. Vesci had moved into the city 8 years ago from somewhere further east. He had built his own operation, smaller but more violent, with the particular methodology of someone who believed that fear was more efficient than loyalty. For several years, there had been an uneasy partition. Vesci took the south and east, Matteo held everything else, and the line between them held because crossing it was expensive for both sides. 6 months ago, Vesci had begun pushing at the line. Why? Lucia asked. He wants what I have, specifically the North Corridor, the port access, the distribution networks. What I've built is cleaner than what he has, more stable. He wants to absorb it. Matteo's jaw tightened. He's been probing for a vulnerability. Lucia looked down at the photograph on the counter. And he found one. Matteo didn't answer. He didn't need to. She picked up her tea. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. So what does this mean? For us? For Sophia? It means you need additional security, and it means you need to know. He stopped, seemed to choose his next words with the care of a man crossing uncertain ground. It means you need to know that you are not an incidental target, Lucia. He sent this photograph because he's identified that you and your grandmother matter to me. He will use that. The sentence sat between them. You and your grandmother matter to me. It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 6 weeks, and he had said it inside a threat assessment, and she felt the absurdity of that somewhere beneath the fear. How much danger are we in? She asked. Right now, he's testing. This photograph is a message, not an action. He wants to see how I respond. Matteo's hands on the table were very still. But it will become an action. I need you to understand that. It will escalate. Lucia was quiet for a moment. Then we need to not be sitting around waiting for it. He looked at her. You said he's been probing for a vulnerability, she said. That means he doesn't know everything. He knows you, care about us. He doesn't know what we know about him, or what I might notice that your people might not. She held his gaze steadily. You said I should have been told the truth earlier. I'm saying the same thing in reverse. Stop managing me. Let me actually help. Something shifted in Matteo's expression. Not surprise. She was starting to believe he was not easily surprised. Something more like recalibration. The quiet adjustment of a man updating an assessment. You don't know what you're offering, he said carefully. I know exactly what I'm offering. I'm not doing it blindly. She put the cold teacup down. I'm doing it because the alternative is sitting in this apartment waiting for the next photograph, and I am done waiting for things to happen to me. The next morning, Karina arrived with a different kind of bag. No bakery this time. A laptop, 2 phones still in their packaging, and a folder of photographs. Surveillance images, schedules, the kind of operational material that made Lucia's stomach tighten as she spread it across the kitchen table. Matteo was already there, jacket off, the first time she had seen him look like a man who used a table for actual work. He walked her through the photographs the way you walk someone through a map of a place they've never been but need to navigate. Vesci's known locations, his lieutenants, the pattern of his movements, which were irregular in ways that were themselves a pattern, she noticed, because absolute irregularity is its own kind of consistency. Here, she said, pointing to a sequence of 3 images taken on different days, different locations. Same car parked in the background of each one. Different plates. She could see that even in the image quality, but the same dent in the rear quarter panel, distinctive, a star-shaped crumple above the wheel well. These are 3 different locations, 3 different dates, but that car is in all of them. Matteo leaned over the table. His shoulder was close to hers. She could feel the focused attention come off him like heat. My people didn't catch that. Your people were looking at Veshi, she said. I was looking at everything else. He straightened up, looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully parse. How did you know to do that? She thought about 18 months of learning to read a room before she entered it, of training herself to notice the details that announced danger before danger announced itself, of survival as an education. Practice, she said simply. The car led them to a warehouse on the eastern edge of the port district, which Mateo's people confirmed within 48 hours was being used as a secondary distribution point for Veshi's operation. It was not a decisive blow. Veshi had redundancies, the way all careful men do. But it was a breach, a real one. And Mateo's organization hit it on a Wednesday night, quietly, efficiently, the way a stone dropped into still water sends out rings that don't announce themselves until they've traveled far from the center. Lucia heard about it from Mateo the next morning. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, and she noticed that he had not slept. Not the sleeplessness of anxiety, but the specific weariness of a man who had been managing complex moving pieces through the night and was now on the other side of it. He had a cut on the back of his left hand that he had not explained and she had not asked about. He'll know it came from inside his own surveillance, Mateo said. He'll start looking for the leak. There is no leak, Lucia said. We found it from outside. He doesn't know that. Mateo looked at the cut on his hand. He'll spend the next week tearing his own people apart looking for an informant. That buys us time. Or it makes him more dangerous, he looked up. Yes, or that. She poured him coffee. He accepted it without comment, and she sat down across from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And the kitchen felt like the eye of something, the quiet center of a thing that was spinning faster on all sides. How many people in your organization know about us? She asked. Me and Sophia. How many people know we're here? A small number. He was watching her carefully. Why? Because Veshi found me in 3 weeks. That's fast for someone working from the outside. She kept her voice neutral. Either he has very good surveillance or someone who knows about us pointed him in the right direction. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than before. Heavier. She watched his face work through the implication. Not the idea that she was wrong. She could see he didn't believe she was wrong, but the specific weight of what it meant if she was right. Someone inside. Someone close enough to know where Lucia and Sophia were. Close enough to know what Lucia meant to Mateo, or was beginning to mean, before Mateo had perhaps fully admitted it to himself. I need you to think about who knew from the beginning, she said, the night you brought us here. Who knew that night? He set the coffee cup down very carefully. 4 people. Tell me about all 4 of them. What? It was Karina who found the thread. Not because she was looking for it, because she was reviewing delivery logs for the apartment building's service entrance, routine security housekeeping, and she found an access record that didn't match any authorized personnel. A maintenance worker had badged in on a Tuesday evening when no maintenance was scheduled. The badge number belonged to an employee who had been terminated 6 months ago. Karina brought it to Mateo. Mateo brought it to Lucia. Lucia looked at the access log and looked at the timestamp and looked at the date and said, very quietly, that was 2 days before the photograph. The terminated maintenance worker's name was Bren. He had worked in building services for Mateo's property company for 4 years before being let go after a disciplinary incident that had been handled internally. He had, in those 4 years, worked in nearly every building Mateo owned, including this one, including the service corridors that ran behind the residential floors. He had a key that should have been deactivated. It hadn't been. The person responsible for deactivating terminated employee credentials in the property management system was a man named Sal, who had been with Mateo's operation for 11 years, who had been present the night Lucia and Sophia were brought to the safe house, and whose name was on Mateo's list of 4. Sal was also, Lucia learned at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning, with Mateo standing very still across the kitchen table and a sound in the hallway that suggested the men outside had shifted their positions in a way that meant something. Sal was also the brother-in-law of one of Veshi's senior lieutenants, a fact that had somehow, in 11 years, never surfaced. Mateo said nothing for a long time. He stood at the kitchen window in the thin October light, and Lucia watched his back and understood that what she was seeing was not rage. Rage would have been simpler, but something more considered and more dangerous. The particular cold quality of a man who has just discovered that loyalty he believed in was theater, and is now deciding what to do with that knowledge. "Matteo," she said. He turned. His face was composed, completely composed. That was almost the frightening part. "He's been in the organization 11 years, he said. Not to her. To the air, to the arithmetic of it, the sheer accumulated length of the betrayal. 11 years. I know. He was at my father's funeral." She didn't say anything. There was nothing useful to say to that. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something unguarded in his expression. Not grief exactly, but the raw edge of a thing that had not yet been processed into anything manageable. A wound still registering as impact rather than pain. "This is what I didn't want," he said. "This. You, in the middle of this. I'm already in it." "I know." His voice was quiet, rough at the edges. "I know that, and He stopped. Something crossed his face that she thought might have been the first unplanned thing he had ever allowed in front of her. "I'm sorry, Lucia." She stood up from the table. She crossed the kitchen. She stood in front of him, close enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to hold his eyes, and she said, "Don't be sorry. Just don't shut me out of what comes next." He looked at her for a long moment. The building hummed. The October light came through the window and lay across the counter, and the cold coffee cups and the photograph they had not thrown away. Then he reached out and took her hand, not with urgency, not with anything theatrical, just the quiet, deliberate gesture of a man who had decided to stop pretending a thing wasn't true. "All right," he said. In the hallway outside, one of his men knocked twice, the signal they had established for news requiring immediate attention. Matteo's hand tightened on hers for just a second before he let go and turned to the door, because the world they were living in did not allow for pauses, did not soften its timing for moments of honesty between two people standing in a kitchen, and what the man in the hallway had to tell him would change the shape of everything that came next. Sal had disappeared, and Vesci had already moved 3 of his crews to the north corridor. The line between them wasn't holding anymore. Sal had a 12-hour head start. Matteo knew it the moment his man Ren finished the sentence in the hallway, because Sal had stopped responding to his phone at 9 the previous evening, which meant he had known the access log would surface, which meant he had been watching for it, which meant the 11 years of proximity and trust had included 11 years of knowing exactly how Matteo's organization ran its internal checks and how much time a man needed to be gone before anyone started looking. Matteo stood in the hallway for 30 seconds. Then he went back into the apartment, picked up his jacket from the kitchen chair, and said to Lucia, "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone except Ren or Karina." He looked at her face. "I mean that." "I know you mean it," she said. "Go." He went. The door closed, and Lucia stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of multiple sets of footsteps moving quickly down the hallway, the elevator, then nothing. The apartment breathed around her. From the back bedroom, she could hear Sophia's radio, the low murmur of a morning talk program, ordinary and oblivious. She looked at the surveillance photographs still spread across the kitchen table. The car with the dented quarter panel, the warehouse, the access logs with Bren's ghost badge number printed in neat columns. She had been looking at these materials for days, and she had found things Matteo's people missed, and she sat back down at the table now because sitting was better than standing and doing nothing was not something she was capable of. She looked at the photographs again. All of them this time, not the ones she'd already analyzed. The ones Karina had brought in the second folder, which she'd moved through quickly. Vesci's known associates, his lieutenant network, faces and names and locations. She found it 40 minutes later. It was a single photograph near the back of the folder, lower quality than the others, taken at distance with a long lens. It showed 3 men outside a restaurant on the south side. 2 of them were identified in the margin notes as mid-level Vesci associates. The third had no notation. He was slightly turned away from the camera, but his profile was clear enough, and the way he carried his weight, the set of his shoulders, the particular way his left hand rested in his jacket pocket. Lucia had seen that jacket before. She had seen those shoulders before. She had watched that specific posture cross her kitchen and accept a cup of tea from her grandmother. The man in the photograph was Ren. She sat very still. She looked at the photograph for a long time, the way you look at something that is trying to rearrange everything you thought you understood. The timestamp on the image was 4 months old. 4 months ago, Ren had been standing outside a restaurant with two of Veshi's people, and no one had flagged it, and now Ren was one of the two men Mateo had just told her to trust with her door. Her phone was on the table. She looked at it. She could call Mateo. She needed to call Mateo. But Mateo had gone into a situation where the people around him already included at least one confirmed traitor, and now possibly two. And if Ren was feeding information to Veshi, then the moment Lucia made that call, Ren would know she'd made it, and Mateo was somewhere in the city without that knowledge, and she did not know how much time any of them had. She picked up the second phone, the one still in its packaging that Karina had brought, never activated. She had kept it in his kitchen drawer under the dish towels, under the lease termination agreement she had never thrown away. She activated it now with hands that were not shaking, because shaking was a luxury she could not afford, and she called the only other number she had memorized from the materials Mateo had shown her. Karina picked up on the first ring. "Don't say my name," Lucia said immediately. "Don't say anything that tells someone listening who you're talking to. Can you get to Mateo directly right now without going through Ren?" A pause. Short, precise. Karina was quick. "Yes." "Do it now. Tell him to look at the photograph in the second folder, back section, third from last. The restaurant on the south side. Tell him to look at the third man's left hand." Another pause. "I understand. Don't use your regular phone to reach him." "I won't." Karina's voice was very steady. "Are you safe?" Lucia looked at the apartment door, looked at the photograph. "Not really," she said. "But I'm working on it." She ended the call. She sat at the table and she thought about the geometry of the situation. Ren was outside her door right now, or should be, and Ren was in a photograph with Veshi's people from 4 months ago, and Sal had disappeared with 12 hours head start, and Veshi had already moved crews to the North Corridor, and all of this was happening simultaneously, which was not coincidence, it was coordination. The knock on the apartment door came 11 minutes later. "Miss Valls," Ren's voice. "Mr. Moretti wants you moved to a secondary location. I have a car downstairs." Lucia did not move from the kitchen table. "Miss Valls?" "Give me a few minutes," she called back. "I need to get my grandmother ready." She went to Sophia's room. Sophia was sitting up in bed with her reading glasses on and the morning program still going, and she looked at Lucia's face and reached for the remote and turned the radio off. "What is it?" Sophia said. "We need to go out the back," Lucia said quietly. "Right now. Can you walk?" Sophia was already swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The building had a service exit on the 9th floor that connected to a stairwell used by maintenance, which connected to an alley-level door that Lucia had found on her third day in the apartment, because finding exits was something she did automatically now. The same way she noticed details in photographs and read posture and understood that the shape of a room could either protect you or trap you, depending on how much attention you paid to it before you needed to know. They were in the alley before Ren knocked on the apartment door a second time. Lucia had Sophia's arm over her shoulders, Sophia moving faster than her 73 years, and bad hip had any business allowing. And they came out into the October cold, and Lucia flagged a cab on the cross street without knowing yet exactly where she was telling it to go. "Dina's shop," Sophia said. Lucia looked at her. "The woman you work for," Sophia said, a little impatiently. "She knows him. She said as much, the way she talked about him when you thought I wasn't listening. If anyone knows somewhere safe, she will." Lucia gave the driver the address. Dina opened the back door of the shop without asking questions, which meant the look on Lucia's face had communicated what words would have taken too long to convey. She put Sophia in the small office at the back with a space heater and a cup of tea, and came out and closed the door and looked at Lucia with the direct, unhurried gaze she used when she had already decided to be useful. "Tell me," Dina said. Lucia told her. The photograph, Ren, Sal, the timing of all of it. She told it fast and without decoration, the way you tell things when there is no time for anything except the structure of the facts. Dina listened. She stood at the pressing table with her arms folded, and she listened until Lucia stopped talking, and then she picked up her own phone, not the shop phone, a personal phone she kept in her apron pocket, and made a call in Greek that was brief, emphatic, and included Mateo's name twice. She hung up. "He's been told you're here. Someone he trusts is bringing him." She looked at Lucia steadily. "Not Ren." "How do you know who he trusts?" Because I've known him for 14 years, and I know the names of the people in his organization the same way I know which fabrics hold a press and which ones don't. Dina unfolded her arms. You found Ren in the photographs? Yes. How long did it take you? 40 minutes? Dina looked at her for a long moment. His own security team has been sitting on those files for weeks. I know, Lucia said. I noticed different things. Dina nodded slowly, the nod of someone updating an internal file. Sit down. He'll be here in 20 minutes. I was there in 17. He came through the back the way Dina had brought them in, and he was alone, no jacket, which meant he had moved fast from wherever he'd been. And when he came through the door and saw Lucia standing at the pressing table, his face did something complicated that he didn't try to manage. Are you hurt? First thing, before anything else. No, Sophia's in the back. He exhaled, one breath controlled, then, show me the photograph. She had taken it from the folder before she left. She handed it to him. He looked at it for a long time, longer than 4 seconds this time, longer than the surveillance photograph of herself that had started all of this. She watched him look at it. The left hand, she said. I see it. His voice was completely flat, the flatness of something that has gone past the range where tone is meaningful. That's the ring he wears. I've seen it 100 times. I should have... He stopped. Set the photograph on the pressing table. Put both hands down on either side of it. How long has he been in place? It was not a question. It was a man doing arithmetic in his head about everything Ren had been present for in the years he had been close, and the numbers were not small. There's more, Lucia said. He looked up. The timing. Sal disappears, Ren immediately offers to move us to a secondary location. Matteo, if Ren had moved us, Vesci would have known exactly where we were inside of 20 minutes. His jaw was tight. Where we were, he said quietly. Sophia. They weren't going to move us somewhere safe. They were going to hand us over. She held his gaze. That was always the plan. We weren't the vulnerability Vesci identified. We were the mechanism. If he has us, he has leverage over you that no amount of territory negotiation can replace. The pressing room was very quiet. Dina had gone to the front of the shop with the particular tact of someone who understands that certain conversations need walls around them. Matteo picked up the photograph. He looked at it one more time. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, and he looked at Lucia with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the composure, not the steadiness, not even the unguarded moment from the kitchen this morning. Something underneath all of those things. Something that was the man before the organization, the person before the constructed exterior, looking at her with an honesty that had nowhere left to hide. You got out, he said. We got out. You didn't call me first. I called Karina. I didn't know who else might be listening to your calls by then. Something moved through his expression. Not pride exactly. Something more like recognition. The acknowledgement of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time. You thought through the exposure risk before you made the call. Yes. Under that kind of pressure. Matteo. She met his eyes. I lived under that kind of pressure for 18 months. I'm very good at thinking under pressure. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched her face. Just his hand against her cheek, brief and deliberate, the most unguarded gesture she had seen him make. And he said very quietly, I know. I'm sorry it cost you that to become it. What happened next moved fast, the way things move when the structure holding them in suspension finally gives. Matteo's people found Ren before Ren found out that Lucia and Sofia had left the building. The details of that encounter Matteo told her later, in broad strokes, without the specifics he had decided she didn't need. What she understood was that Ren confirmed under pressure what the photograph had already said, and added several things the photograph had not, including the location of Sal, who was already with Vesci at a property in the Southern Warehouse District, and the full scope of what Vesci knew about Matteo's operation. The full scope was considerable. Ren had been in place for 3 years. Not 11, not the whole of his time. He had been turned 3 years ago, when Vesci had acquired leverage over him through a debt Ren had accumulated through channels he hadn't disclosed to anyone. 3 years of access. 3 years of the inner circle. Matteo sat in Dina's back office. Sofia had been moved to Dina's apartment upstairs with an escort who was not Ren and not anyone Ren had contact with. And he spread a map of the city on the desk and began doing what Lucia imagined he had always done in moments of acute crisis, working the problem forward from the current position rather than backward through what should have been done differently. He knows our safe locations, Matteo said, all the secondary properties. If Ren had access to property management, he had the addresses. Then we can't use any of them. No. And your North Corridor operations, what's the current status? He looked at her sideways. She had never asked an operational question before. She held the look. 3 crews are in position, he said. But if Ren has been feeding Veishi the crew compositions, he knows exactly where to hit them. She looked at the map. Can you reach them through a channel Ren didn't have access to? Possibly. There are 2 men who reported directly to me, never through Ren's chain. He was already reaching for the phone. It's a narrow window. Then use it. She put her finger on the map, on the port district. And Matteo, Sal is at this warehouse. She pointed to the southern cluster. That's not where Veishi keeps his operation. That's a meeting point. He's there because something is being coordinated right now. He looked at where her finger was. His eyes moved to the northern positions on the map, back to the south. He was doing the calculation she was already doing, the one that said Veishi wasn't waiting for leverage anymore, wasn't in the probing phase, wasn't sending photographs under doors. He's already moved, Matteo said. He moved when Sal disappeared. Sal disappearing was the signal. She looked up. The 12-hour head start wasn't accidental. It was exactly enough time to get his people into position while yours were focused on finding Sal and missed the movement on the North Corridor. Matteo was already calling. He turned away from the map, phone to his ear, speaking in a low, rapid Italian that Lucia didn't follow but didn't need to. She could hear the urgency in it, the specific compression of a man communicating a great deal in very few words to someone who spoke the same shorthand. He hung up, turned back. I reached Marco. He's pulling the North crews back from the exposed positions. Good. The warehouse on the south side. He stopped. His expression had done the thing it did when he was ahead of the sentence, processing the implication before he spoke it aloud. Sal is there. If we move on Sal, Veishi knows we've made Ren. He'll accelerate whatever he's planning. Yes. And if we don't move on Sal, he completes the coordination, and whatever is being planned tonight goes forward without us knowing the shape of it. There was no good option in the room. She could feel that, the specific airless quality of a moment where all the paths forward have a cost, and the only question is which cost you can survive. Matteo looked at her. She looked at him. Outside the shop, the city was going about its morning, oblivious, and the October light was coming through the small back window of Dina's pressing room and lying across the map between them. I need to know something, Matteo said. His voice had changed, not softer, more direct, as if all the layers of management and control had been stripped back to the thing underneath. Whatever happens tonight, and something is going to happen tonight, there's no version of this where it doesn't. I need you and Sophia somewhere Veishi cannot reach, somewhere that does not exist in any file Ren touched. Where? He held her gaze. With me. She understood what he was saying. Not a safe house, not a managed location with personnel and procedures. With him, physically, in the room, where he could see her and she could see what was happening, because the alternative was placing them somewhere that depended on a chain of security that had already proven to have gaps. That puts us in the middle of it, she said. Yes. You said you didn't want me in the middle of it. I said that before tonight. He said it very quietly, and there was something in the quiet that she had not heard from him before. A roughness, an admission. I said that when I thought I could keep you on the outside of it. I can't anymore. And I would rather have you next to me where I can... He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. I need to know you're safe. And the only way I know how to do that right now is to not let you out of my sight. Lucia looked at the map, looked at the window, looked at the photograph still in his shirt pocket, the corner of it visible above the fabric. She had left her apartment in her socks 18 months ago because a man with keys had made her world into a trap, and she had spent every day since then rebuilding something. Not safety, exactly, because she had stopped believing in safety as a permanent condition, but capability. The ability to act rather than simply endure. She looked at Matteo, and she thought about the thread she had decided not to pull, that had unraveled anyway. And she thought about her grandmother upstairs eating whatever Dina had left her. And she thought about the photograph under the door and the car with the dented quarter panel and Ren's left hand in his jacket pocket and all the things she had seen that other people had missed. Then let's not waste time, she said. He reached out. She took his hand. And this time neither of them let go when the knock came at the door. It was Marco, arriving with news that Veshi's crews had not pulled back from the North Corridor, that they were consolidating rather than retreating, that the shape of what was coming was becoming clear. And it was larger than any of them had anticipated, and it was coming tonight, and Matteo Moretti and Lucia Valls walked out of Dina's pressing room into it together, which meant that every calculation Vesci had made about leverage and vulnerability and the particular weakness of a powerful man who had finally found something worth losing, every one of those calculations was now, quietly, catastrophically wrong. Marco's news came in pieces, the way bad news always does. Not as one clean blow, but as a sequence of smaller ones that accumulate into something unsurvivable. Vesci had 17 men on the North Corridor. Not the 3 crews Matteo's surveillance had tracked over the past week, 17, which meant he had been staging them in rotation, cycling them through different entry points so that no single observation post would register the full count. It was patient work, meticulous work. The kind of operational planning that took months and required someone on the inside telling you exactly how Matteo's surveillance was structured, where its gaps were, how long before a new position got flagged. Ren had given him all of that. Marco laid it out on the map in Dina's back office, his finger moving across the port district with the grim precision of a man who had been doing this kind of accounting his whole adult life and had not yet found a way to make it feel like anything other than what it was. Matteo stood across the table and listened without interrupting. Lucia stood beside Matteo. Marco looked at her once, a quick, assessing glance that lasted less than a second, and then looked back at the map. He had stopped questioning her presence 20 minutes ago, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. The warehouse on Dressen Street, Marco said. He's using it as the command point. Sal is there, 3 senior people, and Vesci himself arrived 40 minutes ago. He looked up. He's not directing this remotely. He came in person. He thinks it's already over, Matteo said. He thinks you're running, Marco said. Word got back to him that we pulled the North crews off the exposed positions. He read it as retreat. Good. Matteo's voice was completely flat. Let him keep reading it that way. The problem is the timeline. Marco put his finger on the warehouse. If he's here in person, he's expecting to close this tonight. Whatever he's planned for the North Corridor isn't a sustained campaign. It's a single action, one move, take the port access and the distribution network in one strike, while you're reacting to the internal damage. What's the trigger for the strike? Lucia asked. Both men looked at her. He's waiting for something, she said. He came in person because he wants to be there when it happens. What's the trigger? Marco looked at Matteo. Matteo looked at the map. Something moved across his face. The rapid internal processing she had learned to recognize. The mental architecture of a man who had spent decades playing this kind of chess, working through the positions. Confirmation that we're contained, Matteo said slowly. He's waiting for Ren to confirm our location. Ren is compromised, Lucia said. He knows now. Or he will soon, when Ren stops responding. Which means his trigger disappears. Matteo straightened up. And a man like Vesci, sitting in a warehouse with 17 crews staged and no trigger, he doesn't wait indefinitely. He improvises. How long? Lucia asked. Marco checked his watch. An hour. Maybe less. Matteo looked at Lucia. She looked at him. The hour sat between them like a physical object. Dense, finite, immovable. Then we don't wait for him to improvise, Matteo said. He turned back to the map. We give him his trigger. He can't. The plan was not elegant. Elegant plans required time and perfect information, and they had neither. What they had was a narrow window, 3 reliable men, a map with too many unknowns on it, and the specific advantage of Vesci believing he was ahead of a situation that had already shifted beneath him. Matteo would send a signal through a channel Vesci expected, a secondary communications line that Ren had access to, now controlled by Matteo's people. The signal would indicate that Matteo was moving to a property on the east side, pulling his remaining people in for a defensive position. It would look like exactly what Vesci expected, a man who had discovered his inner circle was compromised, pulling back, going to ground. What it would actually do was pull Vaishi out of the Dresden Street warehouse. A man who had spent months planning this move would not sit in a command post when the target was exposed and retreating. He would move to close it personally. He had come in person for exactly that reason. He'll move with his senior people, Matteo said. 4, 5 men maximum. He won't bring the full crew. He doesn't need them for a defensive position, and he won't want the exposure. And when he moves, Marco said, we take the warehouse first. Sal, the coordination infrastructure, whatever records are there. Matteo's jaw was set. Then we take him. Marco nodded. He had the expression of a man who understood the geometry of what was being proposed and had already identified the point where it was most likely to fail. The gap between the warehouse and intercepting Vaishi in transit, it's tight. I know. If he gets to the east property before we've cleared the warehouse, I know, Marco. Silence. The pressing room smelled like steam and old fabric and the specific close air of people working through a problem that has no comfortable solution. I'll go to the warehouse, Lucia said. Both men looked at her. Not inside, she said immediately, reading Matteo's expression. Perimeter. I know what Sal looks like. I know the car with the dented quarter panel. If it's there, it's a confirmation. If it's not, something's already moved, and you need to know that before you commit. She kept her eyes on Matteo. You need eyes that Vaishi's people won't recognize. None of your men can walk past that warehouse without being made. I can. Absolutely not, Matteo said. Then you're going in without confirmation, and you're doing it on a timeline that doesn't give you recovery time if something's changed. She held his gaze. I'm not asking to be in the middle of it. I'm asking to walk past a building on a public street and tell you what I see. Marco said nothing. He was looking at the map. Matteo looked at Lucia for a long moment. She could see him working through it. Not whether she was right, she could see that he knew she was right, but the specific cost of acknowledging it. The cost of the man who had pulled her out of one dangerous situation, accepting that the same woman was now, by her own choice and by the logic of circumstances, walking toward another one. 2 blocks away, he said finally. His voice was rough. You walk past from 2 blocks distance with a phone. You tell me what you see. You keep walking. You do not stop. You do not approach. If anything feels wrong, I keep walking. Lucia. I know. She met his eyes. I know, Sab. The Dresden Street warehouse was a converted cold storage facility, gray brick, loading bays on the south face, a line of narrow windows along the upper level that had been painted over from the inside. From 2 blocks north, walking east on the cross street, it looked like exactly what it appeared to be. An industrial building in a port district, unremarkable, closed for the evening. The car with the dented quarter panel was parked on the service road adjacent to the south loading bay. Lucia kept walking. She had her phone to her ear, which made her look like any person on any street having a conversation. She was having a conversation with Matteo in a low, continuous murmur, telling him what she saw as she saw it. The car. 2 men at the south loading bay entrance, not moving, hands visible. The particular stillness of people told to hold a position. Light in the upper windows. Not the flat fluorescent spill of an empty building, but the moving, directional light of people with phones and equipment. It's active, she said quietly. They haven't moved yet. How many visible? 2 on the south entrance. The upper windows suggest more inside, but I'd say at least 4 based on the light movement. She passed the cross street and kept her pace even. The car is there. Sal is there. Get clear. His voice in her ear was controlled, but she could hear underneath it the specific tight quality of a man watching something happen from a distance and not being able to close it. Walk north. Marco has a car on the 4th block. Gray. He'll pick you up. I'm walking, she said. She walked. She did not run, because running on a deserted industrial street at night tells anyone watching exactly what you don't want them to know. And she was very good at not telling people what she didn't want them to know. She counted her steps. She breathed. Behind her, from the direction of the Dresden Street warehouse, she heard the low sound of vehicles. Matteo's people moving into position, the particular mechanical murmur of coordinated movement that was now, irreversibly, in motion. Marco's gray car was exactly where Matteo said it would be. She got in. Marco pulled away from the curb without speaking. She sat in the back seat, and her hands were shaking, and she looked at them with a distant, clinical interest. because the shaking was correct. It was the correct physiological response to what she had just done. And she let them shake for exactly the time it took Marco to drive 2 blocks, and then she made them stop. Mateo was inside the Dresden Street warehouse for 11 minutes. She knew this because she counted. She was in the car on a side street 4 blocks away, Marco beside her with a radio that produced short bursts of clipped communication she couldn't fully follow, and she counted the minutes. The way you count things when counting is the only form of control available to you. At 11 minutes, the radio produced a burst that was different in quality from the others, shorter, conclusive. And Marco said clear under his breath, and something in his shoulders dropped a centimeter. "Sal?" Lucia asked. "Contained." Marco didn't look at her. "The records? The coordination materials?" "We got what was there." He paused. "Mateo's moving. Vesci took the signal. He's in transit to the east property. The intercept. The second half of it. The part that required Vesci to be exactly where they predicted, and for nothing to have changed in the gap between the warehouse and the transit route." The radio crackled again. Marco's jaw tightened. "What?" Lucia said. "Vesci changed his route." She felt it move through her. Not panic, something colder than panic, the specific dread of a plan that is held together through everything now developing its first fracture. "How much?" "Enough. He's coming through the port district instead of the east bypass." Marco was already on the phone. "It puts him between us and Mateo's intercept point." "Can Mateo adjust?" "He's trying." Marco's voice was clipped. "There's a choke point on Vellum Street, the bridge. If Vesci crosses it before we close the north end, we lose the intercept entirely." Lucia looked out the window. She knew Vellum Street. She had sat on the bench near the fountain there, the fountain that had been turned off for the season 3 weeks ago, trying to take an honest inventory of her situation. She knew the bridge. She knew the layout. "The bridge has a maintenance access on the east side," she said. "There's a service road that runs under the port approach. It comes out ahead of the choke point." Marco looked at her. "It's a 5-minute drive from here," she said. "If someone is already past the choke point when Vesci crosses the bridge—" "No," Marco said. "Marco, Mateo is coming from the north, and he's already behind the adjusted route." She kept her voice level. "Who else do we have on the south side right now?" Marco said nothing. The radio crackled with Mateo's voice, compressed, urgent, managing the movement of his people through a situation that was changing faster than the plan could absorb. "The service road," Lucia said again. Marco looked straight ahead. His hands tightened on the wheel. Then he put the car in gear. "Go on." The bridge on Vellum Street was a narrow 2-lane structure over the port's inner channel, and at 10:47 in the evening it was empty in both directions, the water below it black and moving, the dock lights catching the surface in long yellow streaks. Vesci's car, a black SUV, one chase vehicle behind it, crossed the bridge at 10:49. Mateo's car came from the north end of Vellum at 10:49 and 12 seconds. Not enough. 12 seconds and 50 meters short of the intercept, and Vesci's SUV was already past the choke point, already accelerating on the far side, and Lucia was watching from the service road below the port approach, and she understood with absolute clarity that the intercept had failed, and Vesci was going to make it to the east property, and whatever defensive position Mateo had left, there was not, had never been, the actual point. The east property was a trap. It had been designed as a trap, the false signal designed to draw Vesci out of the warehouse, and now Vesci was going to arrive at it with 5 men, while Mateo was 50 meters and 12 seconds behind him on the wrong side of a bridge. She called Mateo. He picked up before the first ring finished. "He crossed," she said. "I know." Breathing. He was moving fast. "Stay where you are." "He's going to arrive before you." "I know, Lucia." "What's at the east property?" Her voice came out very steady. "Mateo, what's actually there?" A pause. Brief. Heavy. 2 of my men, and enough to make him believe it's where I was going. 2 men against Vesci and 5 that they know what they're doing. That's not... She stopped, pressed her hand against the car window, looked at the bridge, the water, the yellow dock lights. "Where's the warehouse exactly? The east property? Which building?" "Lucia, stay where you are." "Which building?" "The old freight depot on Aldrin, south entrance." His voice had changed. She could hear in it the specific quality of a man running out of time and knowing it. "Lucia, do not—" She was already telling Marco. The freight depot on Aldrin Street was larger than the Dresden warehouse. A genuine industrial space, high ceilings, concrete floors, the skeletal remnants of loading infrastructure rusting in the corners. Lucia and Marco came in through the north service entrance 40 seconds before Vesci's SUV pulled up to the south. Matteo's two men were already positioned, one at the east wall, one at the overhead catwalk, and they looked at Lucia and Marco with the controlled alarm of people who had not expected reinforcements and were now doing rapid math about what their arrival meant for the geometry of what was about to happen. There was no time to explain. There was barely time to breathe. Vesci came through the south entrance like a man who owned the building and everything in it. He was smaller than Lucia had expected. The photographs had not communicated the specific quality of him, the compressed, coiled energy of someone who had built something dangerous through sheer refusal to accept limits. He had 3 men with him, not 5. 2 had stayed with the vehicles outside. He moved quickly, his eyes going to the room, reading it. He found Lucia almost immediately. She was standing near the east wall, in the open, because stepping back into shadow. When a man like Vesci entered a room, only told him you were afraid, and she was not going to tell him that. She stood where she was and looked at him and let him look back. His expression shifted, a slight recalibration, the acknowledgement of something unexpected. "You're the woman," he said. His accent was Eastern European, clipped and precise. "From the apartment building." "Yes," she said. He looked around the room, at Marco, at the 2 positioned men, back at her. I was doing the same calculation she was doing, numbers, positions, sight lines, and he was fast at it. She could see that, the rapid intelligence of a man who had survived long enough to be dangerous. "Where is he?" Vesci said. "Coming," she said. "How far?" She said nothing. Something moved through Vesci's expression, not anger, something more considered. He took a step toward her, and Marco moved, and the 2 positioned men moved, and for 3 seconds the room held the specific trembling stillness of something about to detonate. Then the south entrance opened again, and Matteo Moretti walked through it, and the stillness broke. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. It was not the kind of confrontation that had choreography or clear sequence. It was close, physical, the brutal arithmetic of bodies in a confined space, sound compressed against concrete, the specific chaos of people who have been building toward a single moment finally arriving at it with everything they had left. Lucia stayed at the east wall. She had been told to stay at the east wall. She stayed there for approximately 90 seconds, watching, tracking the movement of the room, and then one of Vesci's men broke from the south cluster and came at her from the left. And she did not have time to think about any of it. She moved, and the edge of the freight infrastructure caught him at the side of the head with a sound she felt in her back teeth, and he went down. She stood over him, breathing hard, and looked up. Matteo and Vesci were in the center of the floor. Vesci had a gun. It had appeared in the last 30 seconds. She hadn't seen where from. He had it pointed at Matteo from a distance of 6 feet, and Matteo had his hands visible and was very still, the way he went still when he was doing the maximum amount of thinking in the minimum amount of visible movement. Vesci's 2 remaining men had their own weapons up. Marco and the 2 positioned men had theirs. The room was a single pulled trigger from something that nobody walked out of. "You came in person," Vesci said to Matteo. There was something almost like satisfaction in his voice. "I thought you would send people." "I don't send people to things I intend to finish," Matteo said. Vesci's eyes moved to Lucia. They stayed there. "She's why," he said slowly. "That's actually why you came in person." He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a man updating his model. "I thought the woman was leverage. I didn't think she was the reason." Matteo said nothing. "That's a problem," Vesci said, almost gently. "For you. A man with a reason is predictable." He moved his aim. Not at Matteo, the shift was small but deliberate, toward Lucia. And Lucia saw it before it happened, saw the angle of his arm, the adjustment of his wrist, and she saw Matteo's body respond to it before Matteo had consciously decided to respond, the involuntary forward movement of a man whose every instinct was to put himself between the weapon and her, and she understood with complete clarity that if Matteo moved forward, Vesci's finger would close and the bullet was meant to do exactly what it was aimed to do. Not hit her, not necessarily, but move Mateo out of position and into the line of something worse. She moved first, not toward Vesci, across the room, cutting the angle, putting herself not in front of the weapon, but beside it, changing the geometry of the shot in the half-second before it fired. And it did fire, and the sound of it in the concrete space was enormous. And the impact hit her left side like a fist made of heat, and she went down to one knee and stayed there, one hand on the floor, breathing. She heard Mateo's voice. She heard it from very close, and then from further away, and then very close again, and she understood that what she was hearing was him moving, and she was glad about that. She was glad he was moving, because the room was still full of a situation that required moving, and she needed him to focus on that and not on her. "I'm fine," she said, to the floor. Her voice came out wrong, too compressed, the breath behind it doing something strange. She was not fine. She understood that. But she was on the floor with her hand pressed against her left side, and she was conscious, and she could hear the room resolving itself around her. Fewer sounds of movement, the specific silence that follows the last of the resistance going out of a situation. And she kept her hand pressed hard against her side, and she focused on breathing, just breathing, in and out, the cold concrete under her palm, the dock light somewhere outside throwing yellow through the high windows. Mateo's hands found her before the room had fully settled. "Look at me," he said. His voice was not composed. It was the voice of someone who has spent a lifetime managing every external signal of what they feel and has just run completely out of the capacity to do it. "Lucia, look at me." She looked at him. His face, close to hers, was the least controlled she had ever seen it. Not broken, but cracked, the structure of it showing through the surface. Everything he had kept below the waterline of his composure, suddenly and completely visible. "I told you to stay at the east wall," he said. "You would have moved," she said. The breath was still doing the wrong thing, but she could talk, she could form words that seemed important. "If I hadn't changed the angle, he would have moved you, and I know." His hand was over hers, pressing, adding pressure to the wound. His other hand was at the side of her face. "I know what you did." "Is he—" "Yes." She closed her eyes for a second, opened them. The yellow light through the windows was still there. "Sal? We have him." "Marco?" "Here." Marco's voice from somewhere to the left, steady and present. She breathed, in and out. The cold floor, the pressure of Mateo's hand over hers, the yellow light, the sound of the city going about its business beyond the freight depot walls. The ordinary and different world still moving. "Okay," she said. And then, because she could feel the edges of her consciousness beginning to make decisions she hadn't authorized. "Mateo, I need you to get a car." His jaw tightened. "Already done." His voice was rough, stripped down to something essential. "Don't—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, tried again. "Don't you dare close your eyes." "I'm not closing my eyes," she said. She was not closing her eyes. She was looking at him, at the face of a man who had just watched the woman he loved take a bullet that was meant to move him, and she was thinking, with the particular clarity that comes when everything unnecessary falls away, that she had spent 18 months learning to endure what was done to her, and the last 6 weeks learning to act rather than endure, and that this moment, this floor, this man's hand over hers, was not an ending. It was, she thought, with the last of the focus available to her before the car arrived, and Marco lifted her arm over his shoulder, and Mateo's hand stayed pressed against her side all the way to the vehicle. The first moment in a very long time that felt entirely and unmistakably like a beginning. The hospital was a private facility on the north side of the city, the kind that did not appear on public directories and did not ask questions that would generate paperwork and systems Mateo did not control. The surgeon was a compact, gray-haired woman named Dr. Ash, who worked with the focused economy of someone who had seen worse and intended to fix this one anyway. She told Mateo in the waiting room that the bullet had cracked a rib, missed the lung by 11 millimeters, and that Lucia would be in surgery for approximately 2 hours. Mateo sat in the waiting room for the entire 2 hours without moving from the chair. Marco brought coffee at some point. Mateo didn't drink it. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped. And he looked at the middle distance, and he did the thing he had always done in moments that required patience. He worked the problem forward, accounting for every variable, building the next sequence of decisions from the current position. Except that this time the problem he was working forward was not operational. It had nothing to do with territory or networks or the logistics of what came next for what remained of Veshi's organization. The problem he was working forward was simpler and more difficult than any of that. He was trying to determine what kind of man he intended to be after tonight. Marco sat down across from him at the 90-minute mark. He said nothing for a while, which was one of the things Matteo had valued in him for many years. The ability to occupy a silence without trying to fill it. "Sal is talking," Marco said eventually. "I know. He gave us 3 names in Veshi's financial network. The accounts, the routing. It's enough to dismantle the revenue structure entirely. Without the money moving, whatever's left of his operation collapses inside of a month." "I know, Marco." Marco looked at his hands. "Veshi?" "In custody." Matteo paused. "Our custody." Marco absorbed that. "And?" "And he'll answer for what he built." Matteo's voice was quiet. "Absolute. All of it. The infiltration, Ren, what he intended to do with Lucia and Sofia. All of it." Marco nodded. He understood what answer for it meant in the context of the world they operated in, and he did not ask for elaboration because elaboration was not the point. The point was the accounting. The point was that certain things could not be left unresolved without becoming permission for the next version of them. They sat in silence. The hospital hummed its particular hum. Ventilation, distant footsteps, the low machinery of a building designed to keep people alive. "After this," Marco said carefully, "what happens to the organization?" Matteo looked up, looked at his oldest remaining lieutenant, the man who had been with him through the full architecture of what he'd built, who had been present at the beginning and had remained present through everything that had tested it. And he said, with a directness that required no preamble, "I'm stepping back." Marco held his gaze. "How far back?" "Far enough that it's not stepping back. It's out." Matteo looked at his hands. The cut on the back of his left hand had been cleaned and closed with 2 strips of tape, and he looked at it the way you look at something that has stopped hurting but left a mark. "I'm done, Marco. Not because of tonight. Tonight didn't create this, but tonight made it impossible to keep pretending the calculation still works. The organization, you can manage the transition. You know how it's structured. There are people who can absorb the legitimate operations, the properties. All of it can be restructured into something that doesn't require what we've required of it." He paused. "The rest you know how to wind down." Marco was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had the particular weight of a man who has just been handed something he did not expect and is deciding whether it fits. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since before tonight," Matteo said. "Since the night I sat at Lucia's kitchen table and watched her grandmother talk about Naples." He looked at the surgery room doors. "I think I was waiting for a reason that was bigger than myself. I spent a long time not having one." Marco nodded slowly. He picked up the coffee cup he'd brought for Matteo, looked at it, set it back down. "She's going to be all right," he said. "Dr. Ash is the best there is." "I know," Matteo said. They sat together in the waiting room until the surgery room doors opened. Lucia woke up to ceiling tiles and the specific quality of light that belongs exclusively to rooms where people are being kept alive and monitored. She knew she was in a hospital before she was fully conscious, the way the body identifies certain environments before the mind catches up. There was an IV in her left arm. Her right hand, when she moved it slightly, encountered warmth, a hand around hers. She turned her head. Matteo was in the chair beside the bed. He had not slept. She could see that in the specific texture of his exhaustion, the kind that goes past tiredness into something structural. His jacket was gone. His shirt was wrinkled in the way shirts get wrinkled when they've been worn through something physical and then worn further through hours of sitting still. He had been holding her hand in both of his, and when she moved, he looked up, and the thing that crossed his face in that first unguarded second was the truest thing she had ever seen on it. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out wrong, dry, compressed. He reached for the water on the side table and held it for her to drink, which she did. And she watched his face over the rim of the cup and thought that she had seen this man composed and steady and controlled and briefly, rawly open, and that none of those versions had looked quite like this one. Like a man who has come through something that cost him more than he had budgeted for and was still taking the inventory. "Sophia?" she said. "Downstairs. She's been here since 4 in the morning." Something shifted in his expression. almost a smile. She told Dr. Ash that if anything happened to you, she would hold the entire hospital personally responsible. Lucia closed her eyes for a second. The warmth of that information moved through her in a way that had nothing to do with the painkillers and everything to do with the particular specific love of a 73-year-old woman who had shuffled across a cold floor in her slippers and made tea for strangers in a crisis. "Tell her I'm fine," Lucia said. "She'll want to hear it from you." "I know. Give me 20 minutes." He nodded. He hadn't let go of her hand. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Let the room settle. Let the facts of the previous night reassemble themselves in sequence. Veshi. Handled. Sal. Talking. He's given us everything. Ren? Mateo's jaw moved slightly. Ren made his choices. They've been accounted for. She absorbed that. She understood what it meant, and she chose, deliberately and consciously, not to ask for the specifics, because she had made a decision somewhere in the process of the last 6 weeks that there were certain dimensions of Mateo's world she would know, and certain ones she would not, and that this was not ignorance but a boundary she was drawing with full awareness of what sat on the other side of it. "The organization," she said. "What happens now?" He was quiet for a moment. She turned her head to look at him and found him already looking at her with the directness she had come to recognize, the expression he wore when he had something to say that he had decided not to manage or soften. "I'm done with it," he said. She looked at him. "Not the properties, the legitimate operations can stand, but the rest of it." He looked at their joined hands. "I've been building something for 25 years. I told myself it was necessary, that the structure of it served a purpose, that certain things required the kind of authority I'd built to function." He paused. "And maybe some of that was even true at certain times, but I've been using it as a reason for a long time when it stopped being a reason and started being a habit." Lucia said nothing. She was listening. "I had a father who built the same kind of thing," he said. "He died in a room not unlike that warehouse. He was alone. He had spent everything he had building something that nobody could dismantle from the outside, and then it was dismantled from the inside by the people he trusted, because power held by fear always is." He looked at her. "I became a version of him without admitting that's what I was doing. I got very good at it. I told myself I was different because I was smarter, more careful, more controlled." A pause. "Sal was at my father's funeral." She squeezed his hand. "Just that." "I want a different thing," he said, simply, without drama. "I have wanted a different thing since I sat at your kitchen table and your grandmother talked about Naples, and I understood, for the first time in a very long time, what an ordinary evening could feel like." He looked at her face. "I don't know how to build that. I know how to build what I built, but He stopped. "I'm willing to learn." Lucia looked at him for a long time. The hospital hummed. Through the window, the October sky was doing the thing it did in the early morning. That specific shade of gray that comes before the light decides what color to be. "That's the most terrifying thing you've said to me," she said. He looked at her. "Because I believe you," she said. "And believing people is still something I have to practice." Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, but the genuine precursor of one, the real thing before it decides to arrive. "I know," he said. "I'll try to be worth the practice." Sophia came upstairs at the 20-minute mark exactly, as if she had been timing it from the lobby, which she probably had been. She came through the door in the cardigan she'd had on since Dina's apartment, and her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she stood at the bedside and looked at Lucia with the expression of a woman who has been frightened out of her mind and is now converting that fear into something more useful and considerably louder. "You scared me half to death," Sophia said. "I know, I'm sorry." "You are not sorry. You would do the exact same thing again." Lucia thought about the angle of Veshi's arm, the adjustment of his wrist, Mateo beginning to move. "Probably," she admitted. Sophia made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word, and contained both. She sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. Mateo had stood when she came in, and Sophia had looked at him once with an expression that communicated a complete and complex assessment of the previous night and all of its implications, and then had looked at the chair and sat down, which was its own kind of permission. She took Lucia's other hand. "My hip is going to be terrible from that couch downstairs," Sophia announced. I know, I'm sorry about the couch too. And that doctor? Very thorough, I told her so. I heard. She said 6 weeks before you're doing anything strenuous. I intend to enforce that personally. Lucia looked at her grandmother's hand over hers. The thin skin, the raised veins, the specific warmth of it that she had known her entire life. She thought about everything this hand had done for her. Everything this woman had survived long before Lucia was born and continued surviving quietly, without complaint, without ever once suggesting that the world owed her easier terms. Sophia, she said. How do you feel about the coast? Sophia looked at her. Matteo has a property, Lucia said. She looked up at him, standing at the window with the early gray light behind him. You do, don't you? You mentioned it once. A house, he said. Small. On the water. I haven't been there in 3 years. Sophia considered this with the evaluating silence of a woman who has made decisions about living arrangements before under difficult circumstances and knows what questions to ask. Is it warm? She said. Warmer than here, Matteo said. Is there a garden? A pause. There's space for one. Sophia looked at Lucia. Lucia looked at Sophia. Between them moved something that did not require words. The particular communication of two people who have lived in close quarters through enough difficulty that language is often the slower option. All right, Sophia said, and reached for the water glass. And that, as far as Sophia was concerned, was settled. The legal accounting of what had been Vesci's operation took the better part of 2 months and involved people. Matteo dealt with at arm's length through Marco, who managed the transition with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this particular assignment longer than he had admitted to himself. 3 of Vesci's financial network contacts were surfaced through Sal's testimony and removed from the infrastructure through channels that left no record requiring a courtroom. The distribution networks collapsed within 6 weeks, as predicted, once the revenue structure was dismantled. Sal, in the end, received the specific mercy of a man who understood that the difference between a traitor and a desperate person is often only the size of the debt someone else manufactured for them. He was alive. He was considerably diminished. He would not be returning to any city where Matteo's name meant anything. Ren received no mercy. These were the facts of that period, and Lucia knew them and held them in the place where difficult true things are held. Not denied, not dwelled upon, simply acknowledged as part of the full picture of a world that did not operate according to the terms she would have chosen. Carina came by the hospital on the 4th day with the canvas bag and the practical, organized competence that Lucia had come to associate with her, and she sat in the chair Matteo vacated when he went to deal with something Marco needed, and she looked at Lucia with the directness she usually kept professionally submerged. He means it, Carina said. In case you were wondering if he means it, he does. Lucia looked at her. I know. I've worked for him for 6 years. I have never seen him. Carina stopped, reassembled. He is a different person in the last 3 months. I wanted you to know that it started before the warehouse, before any of this. It started around the time he came back from your apartment the first night talking about a woman whose grandmother wanted to know if he was going to put them in a terrible place. Lucia was quiet for a moment. He told you about that? He told Marco. Marco told me. We were all... The professional composure cracked briefly, genuinely. We were worried about him, honestly. He had been running on empty for a long time. Not tired, empty. Like a man maintaining a structure that had stopped serving a purpose he believed in. Carina straightened her jacket. You gave him a reason to look at it honestly. That's not a small thing. I didn't do anything, Lucia said. You sat across the table and asked him what he wanted from you, Carina said. And when he said nothing, you didn't believe him, and he respected that more than if you had. She paused. That turned out to be what he needed. Someone who didn't perform for him and didn't accept his performances. Lucia thought about the folder on the counter for 3 days. The cold coffee. The kitchen table with the surveillance photographs spread across it. The pressing room in Dina's shop. Is the coastal house actually small? She asked. Something arrived in Carina's expression that was, unmistakably, a smile. No, she said. It is not small. They left the city on a Saturday morning in late November, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the streets were doing the things streets do on Saturday mornings, unhurried, domestic, the city taking a breath. Matteo drove. Sophia was in the back seat with a blanket over her knees and the radio on low, and she was already asleep before they crossed the North Bridge, her head against the window, her breathing the slow, even rhythm of a woman who has finally, at 73 years of age, run out of things she needs to stay alert for. Lucia watched the city recede through the passenger window. She watched the buildings give way to highway, to the particular visual grammar of the outskirts, gas stations, warehouse parks, the flat geometry of distribution centers, and then to the wider landscape beyond, hills going brown and gold in the November light, the horizon opening up in the way horizons do when you've been living inside a city long enough to forget they exist. She thought about the apartment on the 11th floor, which she would not go back to. She thought about Dina's pressing room and the smell of steam and old fabric, and the way Dina had made the call in Greek without being asked and without requiring any explanation. She thought about the photograph under the door that had started all of it, the grainy surveillance image of herself coming out of the dry cleaning shop at 6:41 in the evening, the time stamp in the lower right corner, the proof of someone watching. She had been watched before, in the apartment with Derek, in the constant low-grade surveillance of a man who needed to know where she was at all times in order to feel powerful. That watching had been designed to diminish her, to make her smaller than she was, to replace her actual dimensions with the ones that were convenient for someone else's sense of control. The photograph under the door had been designed to frighten her. It had done that. But it had also, inadvertently, shown her that she was visible, that she existed in the world as a person who could be seen and tracked and considered significant enough to use. And somewhere in the navigation of that frightening visibility, she had discovered that she was not who she had been in the apartment with Derek, that the 18 months of surviving that had cost her so much had also built something, not armor, something less rigid than armor, something more like fluency, the ability to read a room, to notice what others missed, to act rather than endure. She had not thanked Matteo for pulling her out. She realized that now, they were 40 minutes out of the city, Sophia asleep in the back seat, the highway unspooling ahead of them, and she had never once said the words directly. She had said, "I know," and "go," and "I'm fine," and then "let's not waste time." And she had said his name in the pressing room with an urgency that contained more than his name, but she had never said, "Thank you for the knock on the door." She looked at his profile, the gray at his temples, more visible in the flat highway light, the set of his jaw, relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before, the specific relaxation of a man who has put down something heavy and is still registering the absence of the weight. "Matteo," he glanced at her. "Thank you," she said, "for the night you knocked on the door." He was quiet for a moment. The highway moved under them. In the back seat, Sophia made a small sound in her sleep and resettled against the window. "I almost didn't," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "I stood in the hallway for probably 3 minutes. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way he described things that were true and that he wasn't going to embellish. "I had decided it wasn't my place, that I had structures for dealing with tenant situations, that getting personally involved in something like that was a breach of my own rules, that I didn't need—" He stopped. "And then I heard something through the door." She waited. "I don't know exactly what it was. A voice, movement, something that made the calculation irrelevant." He glanced at her again, briefly. "I knocked." She looked at the road ahead. The hills were more prominent now, the light doing something in the late morning, going golden at the edges, the way November light does when it commits to being beautiful rather than merely cold. "I'm glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said, quietly, without performance. That was all. They drove in the specific, comfortable silence of people who have been through enough together that silence is no longer something that needs to be filled. The house was not small. It was a white-painted 2-story on a bluff above the water, with a garden that had gone wild in 3 years of absence, overgrown lavender along the south wall, a fig tree that had grown into the trellis, and through it, herb beds that had seeded themselves and spread into territory they hadn't been assigned. The ocean was visible from every window on the east side. In the morning, it was silver, and in the evening, it went amber and then dark, and the sound of it was continuous, not intrusive, but present, the way a heartbeat is present, something the body eventually incorporates into its baseline without registering it as separate from itself. Sophia walked through the garden on the first afternoon with the focused attention of a woman making plans. She crouched by the lavender with her bad hip and tested the soil with 2 fingers and said nothing for a long moment. Then she stood up, slowly, and looked at the overgrown fig tree and the wild herb beds and the view of the water over the south wall, and she said, "This will take some work." "Yes," Matteo said. "I'll need proper tools, not the cheap kind." "Whatever you need." Sophia looked at him with the direct assessment she had been applying to him since the night he appeared in her doorway, asking her to pack a bag. Then she nodded once, the same nod she had given in Dina's office, the same nod that had settled things in the kitchen when Lucia was still arguing with herself about whether to trust what was in front of her, and she went back inside to decide which bedroom she wanted. Lucia stood in the garden after Sophia went in. The wind off the water had a specific quality, salt and cold, and the particular cleanness of air that has traveled a long way before reaching you. She stood in it and let it move through her hair, and she breathed it in. And she was aware, with a clarity she did not try to manage or qualify, that she was standing in a garden by the ocean on a November afternoon and that nothing was going to happen tonight that she needed to be afraid of. That she could, for the first time in 2 years, simply stand somewhere and be where she was. Matteo came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked at the water the way he had looked at the city from the apartment window 6 weeks ago, but differently. Less like ownership. More like someone encountering something he hadn't expected to want and was still learning how to want it without bracing for it to be taken away. After a while, she said, "You're going to have to learn to do nothing." He considered that. "I don't know how to do nothing." "I know. It's going to be uncomfortable." "Probably." "Sophia will put you to work in the garden. That'll help." Something shifted in his face. The real smile this time, full and unguarded. The one she had been seeing the shape of for weeks, and was now seeing arrive completely for the first time. It changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated. Made him look younger, or rather made him look like the younger man who had existed before the decades of controlled composure had built their architecture over him. She reached over and took his hand. He looked down at their joined hands, and then up at her with the particular expression of a man who is holding something he had stopped believing in long enough ago that finding it again requires some adjustment. "I'm not the same person I was before Derek," she said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not going to become her. She's gone." "I know," he said. "The person I am now is—" She considered it. "Harder in some places, more careful in some places. I notice things I can't unnotice. I'll probably always be checking exits." "I know." "You're sure you want someone who checks exits?" He looked at her. "I want someone who found the car with the dented quarter panel in 40 minutes when my people missed it for weeks," he said. "I want someone who changed the angle of the shot in the half-second before it fired. I want someone who told me not to be sorry and to not shut her out." He held her gaze steadily. "I want you, Lucia. The specific version of you that exists right now, with everything it costs to become her." The water moved below the bluff. The lavender, overgrown and wild, stirred in the salt wind. Inside the house, they could hear Sophia moving between rooms, her footsteps deliberate and unhurried, the sound of a woman deciding how to inhabit a space and making the decision with the confidence of someone who has survived enough to know that home is not a place you find, but a quality you bring. Lucia looked at Matteo's hand in hers. Then she looked at the ocean. She thought about the knock on the door. The fraction of a second, he had said. 3 minutes in the hallway, almost walking away. Almost. And then something heard through a door, something that made the calculation irrelevant, and the knock that had changed the shape of everything. She thought about how many things existed in the almost. How much of a life is made in the gap between the thing you nearly didn't do and the thing you did. "Okay," she said. Not the way she'd said it on the warehouse floor with her hand pressed against her side, not with the compressed urgency of someone managing a crisis, but simply, quietly. The way you say a thing when you mean it all the way through. The wind moved through the garden. The ocean did what oceans do. Inside the house, Sophia called out something about the bedroom with the east window. her voice carrying the tone of someone who had already decided and was notifying rather than asking. Matteo and Lucia stood in the wild garden above the water, and the November light did its golden thing at the edges, and they were where they were. And for the first time in a very long time, where they were was enough. The first week at the house was not quiet. Sophia made sure of that. She was up before the sun every morning, which meant Lucia was up before the sun, which meant Matteo, who had spent 25 years operating on 4 hours of sleep and had never once considered this a problem, discovered that the specific quality of being awake at 5:30 in the morning in a house by the ocean was entirely different from being awake at 5:30 in a city managing a crisis. There was no crisis. There was just the dark, and the sound of the water, and the smell of coffee that Sophia made strong enough to strip paint, and the particular low-level domestic noise of a woman who had decided that the wild garden was a personal affront and intended to correct it. He found her outside on the third morning with a pair of shears she had located in the garden shed, attacking the lavender along the south wall with the focused intensity of someone settling a score. "You should be sleeping," he said. "I slept," Sophia said without stopping. "It's 5 in the morning." "The lavender doesn't know that." She cut a long, overgrown stem and examined it. "Hand me that bucket." He handed her the bucket. He stood in the cold morning air in his shirt sleeves, watching a 73-year-old woman with a bad hip reshape an overgrown garden bed with the authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly this task. And he felt something move through him that he did not immediately have a name for. Not happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for what it was. Something more like the physical sensation of pressure releasing. A structural thing. The feeling of a load-bearing wall discovering it no longer needs to bear the load. He went inside and made more coffee and brought a cup out for Sophia, who accepted it without breaking her rhythm, and he sat on the stone step at the garden entrance and watched the sky go from black to gray to the specific pale gold of early coastal morning. And he thought about nothing in particular, which was new enough that he noticed it. Lucia's recovery moved the way recovery actually moves, not in a straight line, not with the clean narrative arc of a person getting progressively better each day, but in the uneven, sometimes frustrating rhythm of a body doing complex work on its own schedule. There were good days and days that weren't good, days when the cracked rib made itself known with a sharpness that cut through whatever she was doing, and days when she forgot about it entirely until she moved wrong and remembered. Dr. Ash came out from the city at the 2-week mark, driving herself in a small, unremarkable car, and examined Lucia in the room with the east window that Sophia had claimed, and then graciously surrendered for the appointment. She prodded and measured and asked questions with the focused economy of someone billing every minute, and she told Lucia the healing was on schedule, and that on schedule meant what it meant and not what Lucia wanted it to mean. 6 weeks, Dr. Ash repeated, packing her bag. "You said that." "I'm saying it again because your face when I said it the first time suggested you were calculating exceptions." Lucia said nothing. She had been calculating exceptions. Dr. Ash looked at her over the top of her glasses. "The rib will heal completely. The tissue damage will resolve. You will be, in approximately 6 weeks, functionally the same as you were before." She paused. "What you do with that is your own business. But you don't get there faster by pushing the timeline." After she left, Lucia sat in the east window room and looked at the ocean, which was doing its silver morning thing, and she thought about the word functionally. Functionally the same. She understood what Dr. Ash meant, the medical meaning, the structural meaning. She also understood that there was no version of the same that applied to the rest of it. The person who had stood in that freight depot and changed the angle of the shot was not the same person who had pressed herself against a kitchen wall clutching a dish towel. And the person she was becoming here in this house, with the ocean and the overgrown lavender and Sophia's 5 a.m. gardening and Matteo learning to sit still, that person was something else again. Something she didn't have the full shape of yet. She was, for the first time she could remember, curious about it, rather than afraid of it. Marco came once, at the end of the 3rd week. He drove himself, no escort, and he sat at the kitchen table with Matteo for 2 hours, while Lucia and Sophia were at the market in the village 20 minutes down the coast. Sophia's first real outing, which she had been preparing for with the logistical seriousness of a military operation. When Lucia came back, Marco was gone. Matteo was standing at the east window with a cup of coffee, looking at the water. She put the market bags on the counter. Sophia continued through to the garden with the herb seedlings she had acquired with single-minded focus from a vendor who had initially tried to overcharge her and then, confronted with the full weight of Sophia's negotiating style, had thought better of it. "How was it?" Lucia asked. Matteo turned from the window. His face was the composed version, the managed version, and she looked at it and waited. He exhaled. "The last of Vesci's network is dismantled. Marco has confirmed the financial structure is gone. It'll take years for anyone to try to rebuild what he had, and the people who might try know what happened to him." He paused. "The North Corridor properties are being transferred into a legitimate holding structure. The whole thing, the port access, the distribution networks. It'll operate clean inside of 90 days. "And Marco?" she asked. Matteo looked at his coffee cup. "He'll be all right. He's better at this than I was at understanding when to let something go." A pause. "He said to tell you that the photographs are gone. All of them. Every surveillance file that had your name or your face in it. Clean." She absorbed that. The photograph under the door. The timestamp in the lower right corner. Her own face, grainy and enlarged, outside Dina's shop at 6:41 in the evening. Gone. "Good," she said. She started unpacking the market bags. After a moment, Matteo set down his coffee and came to help, which he did with the slightly uncertain quality of a man learning the physical grammar of a shared domestic life, and not yet entirely fluent in it. He put things in the wrong places twice. She moved them without comment. He watched where she moved them and didn't make the same mistake again. That was, she thought, actually a fairly accurate portrait of who he was. Dina called on a Sunday afternoon in early December, when the garden had been substantially reorganized by Sophia and the fig tree had been negotiated back to within its intended boundaries, and the house smelled like the rosemary that was now growing in pots along the kitchen windowsill. Lucia took the call sitting on the stone step at the garden entrance, in the thin winter sun, watching Sophia instruct Matteo on the correct technique for turning compost, which he was attempting with the focused seriousness he applied to everything and which was producing results Sophia characterized as acceptable for a beginner. "How is it?" Dina asked. "Quiet," Lucia said. "Good quiet or bad quiet?" Lucia watched Matteo turn compost under Sophia's direction. "Good quiet," she said. "Really good quiet." A pause. She could hear the pressing room in the background, says the hiss of steam, the particular ambient noise of the shop. "I have a girl asking about your job," Dina said. "For the counter. She's young, she's quick. I think she'll be fine." "Good," Lucia said. "Give her the afternoon shift. She'll want mornings until she learns the rhythm, but afternoons are better for the counter traffic." "I know how to run my shop," Dina said, but warmly. "I know you do." A longer pause. The steam hissed. "You sound different," Dina said. Lucia thought about that. She looked at the ocean over the south wall. "I think I am different." "Good different?" "I think so." She paused. "I'll know better in another few months." Dina made the sound she made when something satisfied her. Short, definitive, a sound that contained an entire assessment without requiring elaboration. "Call me when you know," she said, and hung up. The thing Lucia had not expected about the house by the water was what it did to time. In the city, time had texture. Urgent, granular, always moving toward or away from something. Even the good stretches in the city had the quality of intervals, breathing spaces between demands. Here, time moved differently. It expanded. A morning could contain the full sequence of coffee and garden and ocean light and a conversation and silence and more coffee and still feel unhurried. Days had edges, but the edges were soft. She started, in the 4th week, to draw. She had not drawn since she was 19, when she'd had 2 semesters at a community college before the money ran out, and the practicalities of survival had reorganized her priorities. She found a sketchbook in the village market and some pencils, and she sat at the east window in the mornings before Sophia was fully operational, and she drew the ocean, badly at first and then less badly, the way skills come back when you give them space to. Matteo found her at it one morning and looked at the sketchbook over her shoulder without speaking. She kept drawing. "You're good," he said finally. "I was better at 19. "You'll be better than 19 again." She looked up at him. He said it with the simple certainty of someone stating a fact he had no doubt about. and she felt the particular quality of being believed in, not performed at, not flattered, simply seen and assessed and found capable by someone whose judgment she had come to trust. She went back to the drawing. He went to make coffee. The ocean did its silver thing. On a Wednesday in the middle of December, Lucia went into the garden after dinner and found Matteo sitting on the stone step in the dark, looking at the water. She sat beside him. The air was cold and clean, and the sky above the ocean was doing something extraordinary, clear and very deep, the stars more present than they ever were in the city, the kind of sky that makes you feel the actual size of things. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. "I want to ask you something," Lucia said. "Ask." "Do you miss it?" He was quiet for a moment. She knew him well enough now to know that the pause was not evasion. It was genuine consideration. He did not answer questions like this casually. "Parts of it," he said. "The competence of it. The feeling of understanding exactly how something worked and being able to move it." He looked at the water. "Not the weight of it. Not the cost of it." Another pause. "Not who I had to be to maintain it." She nodded. "Do you miss the city?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. The dry cleaning shop. Dina. The bench by the fountain on Vellum Street. The specific urban noise of a place that never fully slept. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss Dina. I miss the feeling of earning something with my hands every day." She looked at her sketchbook, which she'd brought out and set beside her on the step. "But I don't miss being afraid. And I was afraid there from the moment I arrived, even before Derek. The city was always loud in a way that made it hard to hear myself think. And here?" She looked at the ocean, at the stars, at the overgrown and now recovering garden, Sophia's work visible in the new order of it, at the man sitting beside her on the cold stone step, who had learned in 4 weeks to make coffee at 5 a.m. and turn compost correctly and sit in silence without treating it as a problem to be solved. "Here I can hear myself," she said. He reached over. She gave him her hand. They sat in the dark above the water, and the stars did what stars do. Ancient, indifferent, present. And the sound of the ocean was continuous, and the garden smelled like rosemary and turned earth. After a while, Matteo said, very quietly, not looking at her but at the water, "I love you. I want you to know I know what that means. I'm not saying it the way I've said other things. Managed. I'm saying it because it's true, and I've spent enough of my life not saying true things that I don't intend to waste the time I have left doing that." She sat with it, let it be what it was, without rushing toward it or away from it. "I know," she said. Then, "I love you too. I'm still learning what that means for me, but I know it's true." He nodded. He didn't push past it, didn't need it to be more than it was in this moment, didn't reach for the next thing. He simply sat with it the way she had sat with the quiet, the way they were both learning to sit with things that were good without bracing for them to be taken away. The ocean moved below the bluff. Inside the house, through the kitchen window, they could see the light Sophia had left on, warm and yellow and ordinary, the light of a room that was inhabited and intended to stay that way. Lucia leaned her head against Matteo's shoulder. He rested his cheek briefly against the top of her head. The cold air moved around them. The stars held their positions. They stayed there until the cold drove them in, and then they went inside, into the warm yellow light, and Sophia had left tea on the stove, and the rosemary on the window sill was green and growing, and the ocean kept its continuous sound against the bluff below, patient and present, and indifferent to everything except the fact of itself. Which was, Lucia thought, putting her hands around the warm teacup, while Matteo turned off the lights, and Sophia's radio played something old and tuneless from the back of the house, which was, in the end, exactly enough.